What does it feel like to be ground up like hamburger meat? In May 1969, an American soldier used those exact words to describe his reality. He wasn't in a slaughterhouse. He was on a nameless hill in Vietnam, a 3,000-foot-tall lump of mud and jungle designated only by a number, 937. For 10 days, he and his brothers in the 101st Airborne charged up that slope into an invisible wall of machine gun fire. For 10 days, the jungle screamed with the sounds of battle and the cries of the wounded. They fought through mud, monsoon rains, and an enemy they could hear but rarely see. Finally, on May 20th, they took the summit, a victory, soaked in blood. But then, just weeks later, the army ordered them to walk away, to abandon the very ground they had paid for with their lives. This is the story of a battle that broke the will of an army and made a nation question everything. A battle for a hill that had no strategic value, yet demanded a horrific price. A place that would be forever known not as Hill 937, but by the brutal nickname the soldiers gave it, Hamburger Hill. Before the first shots were fired on Hamburger Hill, the A Shau Valley was already a place of ghosts. For years, this valley, a deep green scar running along the Laotian border, was one of the most critical battlegrounds in Vietnam. It was a phantom highway, a central artery of the legendary Ho Chi Minh Trail. Imagine a network of jungle paths, hidden from the sky, used to funnel an entire army, troops, weapons and supplies from North Vietnam into the south. For years, American forces had tried to sever this artery. They bombed it, patrolled it, and launched massive operations to cleanse it. But the North Vietnamese army, the PAVN, were master of this terrain. They were like the jungle itself, resilient, deep-rooted, and almost impossible to uproot completely. They had deep tunnel networks, camouflaged bunkers, and a fighting spirit that had already tasted American blood. In 1966, the PAVN had overrun a U.S. Special Forces camp right here in this valley, forcing a humiliating American retreat. Ever since, the A Shau had been enemy territory, a forbidden zone. By 1969, U.S. commanders were itching to strike back. They knew the North Vietnamese were using the valley as a staging ground to rebuild and plan new attacks. This led to Operation Apache Snow, a massive three-phase campaign designed to push the PAVN out of the A Shau once and for all. It was an overwhelming show of force, thousands of American and South Vietnamese troops, waves of airstrikes, and unending artillery barrages. The goal was to break the enemy before they could launch another major offensive, and at the heart of that operation was one particular ridge, a towering jungle-choked peak that didn't look like much on a map. It had no towns, no roads, no bases. It was just Hill 937. So why attack this specific hill? As American troops pushed deeper into the valley, intelligence reports began to paint a disturbing picture. Hill 937 wasn't empty. The enemy was there, and they were there in force. Major General Melvin Zayas, the U.S. commander in charge, a man with a reputation for aggressive action, ordered his troops to take the hill. The mission seemed straightforward. The North Vietnamese typically avoided large set-piece battles with the Americans. They preferred to strike and fade back into the jungle. But this time was different. This time, they didn't run. They were waiting. The enemy had a plan. The PAVN's 29th Regiment, an elite unit known as the Pride of Ho Chi Minh, had turned Hill 937 into a fortress. They had spent months transforming the mountain into a multi-layered death trap. This wasn't just a few foxholes, it was a labyrinth of bunkers, trenches and tunnels, all perfectly concealed by the triple canopy jungle. Machine gun nests were placed in interlocking fields of fire, and snipers were hidden in the trees like spiders in a web. They had prepared for a long, bloody siege. The Americans, however, were flying blind. The jungle canopy was so thick that aerial surveillance was almost useless. Intelligence reports were vague. They didn't know how many enemy troops were on the hill, or just how sophisticated their defenses were. The task of capturing this fortress fell to the legendary 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagle. Specifically, 3 battalions were sent into the valley, led by the hard-charging Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt and his 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, the Rakkasans. These were some of the most battle-hardened troops in Vietnam, but even they were not prepared for what was waiting for them on Hamburger Hill. The American plan of attack was classic search and destroy. Small patrols would make contact, pinpoint the enemy's location, and then the sky would fall. They would call in overwhelming firepower, airstrikes, artillery, and helicopter gunships to obliterate the enemy from a distance. But the plan fell apart the moment it met the reality of Hill 937. The jungle was a nightmare. It was so thick that soldiers could barely see a few feet ahead. The ground itself was an enemy, a steep, treacherous slope of sharp rocks, slick mud, and tangled vines that grabbed at their feet. And the weather was a suffocating blanket of heat, humidity, and torrential rain that made every step exhausting and every weapon prone to jamming. On May 10, 1969, the first troops landed at the base of the hill. They expected a fight, but they walked into one of the deadliest killing grounds of the entire war. From the very start, the US fundamentally underestimated their opponent. They thought the pavilion would break and run after a few days. Instead, every time American troops pushed forward, they were met with a storm of machine guns, mortars, and sniper fire. The enemy was invisible, hidden in deep, reinforced bunkers that shrugged off the artillery shells and bombs. Even the terrifying might of American air power barely made a dent. The jungle canopy absorbed the explosions, and the earth swallowed the shrapnel. Chaos reigned. The dense terrain made radio communication nearly impossible. Units became separated, lost in the green hell. The hill was so steep that medevac helicopters couldn't land, making the evacuation of the wounded a torturous, often fatal ordeal. By May 12th, the battle had devolved into a grinding, bloody stalemate. Companies were charging up the hill, only to be thrown back, shredded by enemy fire. Some units lost nearly half their men in a single, futile assault. Colonel Honeycutt, the commander on the ground, was aggressive and relentlessly determined. He ordered attack after attack after attack, refusing to yield, but his own men, caked in mud and blood, began to see his determination not as bravery, but as a death sentence. They felt like they were fighting ghosts. The enemy was everywhere, but they could see no one. By May 17th, the battle for Hamburger Hill had become a slow-motion nightmare. It was no longer a battle of tactics. It was a contest of attrition, a meat grinder. Every foot of ground gained was paid for in blood, and every small victory was temporary. The attacks were now coming from multiple directions, a pincer movement from the north and south, designed to break the stalemate, but the North Vietnamese had anticipated this. Their defensive network was designed to withstand attacks from all sides. Hidden machine gunners and snipers would hold their fire, waiting with terrifying patience for US troops to get just close enough, and then they would open up, cutting down entire squads in seconds. The terrain itself became a weapon against the Americans. The rain turned the steep slopes into a river of mud, making it impossible to dig in or even keep your footing. Weapons rusted, supplies dwindled, and bodies piled up, and then in the heart of the chaos, the unthinkable happened. A U.S. aircraft, trying to drop its payload on an enemy position, misjudged its target. The bombs fell on American troops. The friendly fire incident killed and wounded dozens, shattering what little morale was left. It was a horrifying symbol of the battle itself, a fight so confusing and brutal that the Americans were now killing their own. By the evening of May 19th, after 9 days of relentless fighting, the hill was still in enemy hands. US casualties had soared into the hundreds. The once lush jungle was now a scorched, skeletal landscape. For the soldiers on the ground, the question was no longer about winning. It was about surviving. They were being ordered up the same blood-soaked slopes, time and dan, only to get shot to pieces by an enemy that seemed to have an endless supply of men and ammunition. After 9 days of slaughter, The commanders knew there was only one option left: a final, overwhelming assault. On the morning of May 20th, the sky over Hill 937 erupted. For hours, a storm of American firepower rained down: artillery, bombs, and gelid gasoline, napalm that turned the jungle into an inferno. The goal was to burn and blast away the enemy's cover once and for all. Then came the order. 4 battalions, including both American and South Vietnamese troops, attacked the hill simultaneously from all sides. They stormed through the smoldering remains of the jungle, into the trenches and bunkers. By now, the napalm had burned away much of the foliage, finally revealing the enemy's last strongholds. What followed was brutal, intimate, and medieval. It was close-quarters combat fought with grenades, bayonets, and rifle butts. Soldiers cleared the enemy bunkers one by one, fighting in the dark, suffocating tunnels. Finally, after 10 days of unimaginable hell, American forces reached the summit of Hill 937. The surviving North Vietnamese soldiers had been forced to retreat. The hill was taken, but as the smoke cleared, the true cost of victory became horrifyingly clear. 56 American soldiers were killed, and over 370 were wounded. On the other side, an estimated 630 North Vietnamese soldiers lay dead across the battlefield. The hill was a wasteland of bomb craters, burned trees, and bodies. The American troops were exhausted, battered, and filled with a cold, simmering anger. They had fought for 10 days to conquer this hill. They had no idea they were about to give it right back. Less than 3 weeks after the last shot was fired, the U.S. Army abandoned Hamburger Hill. The 101st Airborne was ordered to withdraw. The decision was part of a larger strategic shift to pull forces out of remote border regions. But for the men who had bled on that hill, it was an act of supreme betrayal. And it sparked a firestorm of outrage back home. Families watched news reports of their sons being sent into one of the war's deadliest battles, only to learn the prize was given up without a fight. Major General John A. Wright, who took command of the 101st Airborne, tried to explain it away, stating bluntly, "This is not a war of hills. That hill had no military value whatsoever." Wait, what? If the hill had no military value, then why did 56 Americans have to die for it? The statement, meant to calm the controversy, was like throwing gasoline on a fire. The psychological toll on the survivors was immense. They were traumatized, and they were furious. Their trust in their leaders was shattered. Reports began to surface of fragging attempts. Soldiers so enraged they tried to kill their own officers. Colonel Weldon Honeycutt, the commander who had pushed them up the hill relentlessly, became a lightning rod for their anger. A supposed $10,000 bounty was placed on his head by his own men. For many veterans, the feeling was unanimous. One soldier later recalled, "We fought so hard for that hill, and in the end it meant nothing. We lost good men for nothing." Another simply called it a slaughterhouse, a senseless waste of life. The shockwaves from Hamburger Hill rocked America. The war was already deeply unpopular, but this battle became a powerful symbol of a conflict that seemed directionless, brutal, and impossibly costly. The controversy exploded in the U.S. government. Senator Edward Kennedy took to the Senate floor, his voice filled with outrage, calling the battle senseless and irresponsible. He, along with other powerful senators, demanded to know why American boys were being sacrificed for hills that the military itself admitted were worthless. But the real turning point came on June 27, 1969. Life magazine published one of the most shocking issues in its history. On its cover were the faces of 242 American soldiers, all killed in a single week of fighting in Vietnam. While only a few had died on Hamburger Hill itself, the public connected the images directly to the battle they'd been hearing about. Suddenly, the war wasn't an abstract policy debate. It was the faces of hundreds of young men, some barely out of high school, Staring back from the page, the backlash was so severe that it forced a fundamental change in U.S. military strategy. General Creighton Abrams, the top U.S. commander in Vietnam, quietly ordered a halt to the maximum pressure tactic. The new approach, called protective reaction, focused on minimizing American casualties. The era of large-scale frontal assaults was over. At the same time, President Richard Nixon announced the first major troop withdrawals, accelerating his policy of Vietnamization, the gradual handover of the war to the South Vietnamese. Hamburger Hill didn't cause this shift alone, but it was the bloody catalyst that made it politically unavoidable. The Battle of Hamburger Hill was more than a fight. It was a mirror held up to the Vietnam War, reflecting its brutal truths. It proved that tactical victories could feel exactly like strategic defeats. It showed that the bravery of soldiers on the ground could be squandered by the flawed strategies of the men in command. Today, the jungle has grown back, covering the bomb craters and bunkers. The hill is silent again, but the scars of that battle remain, not just on the land, but in the memory of a nation and in the lives of the men who fought there. For them, it was a turning point, the moment many realized the war was lost, long before the final helicopter lifted off the embassy roof in Saigon. It stands as a haunting reminder of the human cost of war, and it forces us to ask the hardest questions. When is a battle worth fighting, and at what cost? The story of Hamburger Hill is a scar on the face of history, but there are countless other scars, other battles, and other forgotten stories that demand to be told. To make sure those stories and the lessons they carry are never lost to time, make sure to subscribe and join us on our next journey.